so this video we're going to talk about the probability of complementary events. And complementary events will have a sum of 1. So that'll be something that kind of shows up with some of these examples that we look at here. Now, when it comes to a sum of 1, so let's write that in here. So remember that. Sum of 1. Sometimes you might see complementary events have the probability in fraction form or decimal form. You also may see it in percent form. So if it's in percent form, you may have a sum of 1 and basically turn a 1 into a percent. So if you have 1 and you turn that into a percent, remember just a review here, stuff we've done in the past. You're turning a number into a percent, you grab the decimal and go 2 spaces to the right. So 1 is the same thing as 100%. So if it's percents for complementary events, it'll be a sum of 100%. If it's a fraction or a decimal, it'll be a sum of 1. So let's look at some examples where you might see this. Now, one thing I basically see this every day when I'm getting ready to go to work. I go back in, I look at the weather, see what it's going to be, and a lot of times I'll show the percent chance of rain. So let's say for this scenario, we have a 70% chance of rain. And so what we're going to basically do is come back in and see what's the percent chance it's not going to rain. So if the probability of rain on that day is 70%, to get the complementary event of this, basically the probability that it's not going to rain, you're simply going to go back in and take that 100% and subtract 70 from it. So you do 100 minus 70. So if you're keeping it in percent form, you'll have an answer of 30% there. So complementary events, once again, these sums together give me that 100%. Let's say, now, when you watch the weather, it's always going to be in percent form when we're talking about percent chance of rain, but let's say you didn't have 70%. Let's say you had this as a fraction. So if you had it as a fraction, 70% as a fraction would be 7/10. You could also write 70 over 100. I just took the 0 off the top and the bottom. Either way, it's the same thing. So in this scenario, if it was in a fraction form, you want to find out the complementary event of that, you would do 1 minus the fraction. So 1 minus 7/10. And remember, 1 is the same thing as 10/10. That's like 10 divided by 10, which will give me 1. So you say 10/10 minus 7/10. So that would give me 3/10. And 3/10 is the same thing as 30% if I was to turn that back into a percent. So that's a situation where you might have fractions there. So these will be complementary events, because if I go back in and I add 7/10 and 3/10 back together, it will give me a sum of 1. Let's say it was in decimal form. So over here, let's say you had 0.7 as 7/10. Do the same thing we did here a minute ago, except this time we're using decimals, so it'll be 1 minus 7/10. Now, if you ever had to do this, I would set it up vertically. And do 1.0 minus 0.7. In other words, 1 and 0/10 minus 7/10. And here you would get 3/10. So over here, these complementary events will go back and give you a sum of 1 as well. So that's an example of a situation where I might have percents as complementary events. So 70 and 30 would give you 100%. You might have fractions. So 7/10 and 3/10 together would give you 1. And then decimals down here would be 7/10 and 3/10 added back together would also give you 1. Typically, I feel like you see it more with the percents or the fractions rather than the decimals, but I want to show you all three just in case you ran across decimals as well. Let's have you try a problem now. So let's say, let's change the percent. Let's do 90%. So the probability of rain is going to be 90%. So I want you to tell me the probability that it will not rain. And so let's do it in percent, fraction, and decimal form. So I want you to turn 90%, or basically not turn 90%, but I want you to find a complementary event of 90%. That as a fraction would be 9/10, and that as a decimal, like this, 0.9. So find out the probability of rain as a percent of fraction. The probability it's not going to rain as a percent, fraction, and decimal. So pause the video and take a second, see if you can solve for those three pieces. Alright, so here you should have said 100, 100 minus minus 90. So 10% should be your percent. Scoot that over, make sure you can see that. So there you go, 10% is one of your answers. Over here you would do 1 minus 9 tenths. So I would do 10 tenths minus 9 tenths. Remember 10 tenths is the same thing as 1. Subtract that and you would get 1 tenth. And then finally, if it was a decimal, I would do 1.0 minus 0.9. In other words, 1 and 0 tenths minus 9 tenths, and still get 1 tenth as a decimal. So these should have been your 3 answers here. Now, as I mentioned to you, typically you see it with the percents or the fractions, but occasionally you'll see the decimal pop in too. So just use the same method as you will with the fraction if you see the decimal. All right, so this is a couple examples here for probability of complementary events. See ya.